I suppose could we start from the beginning then? What does IPE mean to you?
Oh, I was fascinated by three questions when I was an undergraduate, and they're probably the three questions that dominated the intellectual landscape. Nuclear annihilation, underdevelopment inequality, and the environment, which was just starting to poke its head up. And I had been deeply involved with nuclear annihilation. And that was fun. I mean, let me tell you, there were times when I would hear lectures and do readings on Friday, and I didn't want to get out of bed till Monday. Then I took some courses in development and underdevelopment. And political economy was, for me, a very different sense of how we might organize our thoughts about the world around us. It was not apocalyptic. It was also not all happy, happy, joy, joy. There were an awful lot of things that I needed to understand that I didn't. And so for me, it really was a kind of an eye-opening experience about how to look at day-to-day kinds of things without the sword of Damocles hanging over one's head constantly.
When you were saying you were really interested in nuclear annihilation, in a practical kind of sense, or
you mean was I cheering for it? Is that,
yeah. I have this image of you now as a bomber pilot.
That's right. Have you seen Failsafe? You need to. That was really the hot issue. No pun intended. A nuclear balance of terror was really important, and people. It's not as simple as it seems. People were making really interesting arguments about the nature of arms racing and the nature of decision making. And then, of course, there were always weird propagandistic comments being made about how you can survive this stuff or you can't survive this stuff. And I was just fascinated by great power politics. I think a lot of undergraduates get into the study of international relations historically, and in a very pedestrian way, because they're interested in, guns and bombs and stuff like that. And some stay there, and some, like me, interestingly enough, I still read a bit in that area, and I still write a bit in that area, but I found a more immediate understanding of the world around me by looking at materiality, right? Can I eat? Can I clothe myself? Is it really important to me to make sure someone else cannot clothe themselves or eat? And that's sort of where I think this was probably my junior or senior year as an undergraduate. I did interesting readings on a radical Latin American political economy. I had a professor who made me read Gunder Frank and Samir Amin and some of those folks, and it was just eye-opening. I was fascinated. The Third World, which is what we used to call it from a strategic studies standpoint, was not an asterisk in somebody's category. It really was important. There were real people there.
So just picking up on what you just said in terms of both the people that influence you off the page, but also the people, and obviously you've written widely on Google Frank.
I have, yes.
I don't know if you wanted to say a few words about how both that reading and also the people that referred you onto that reading influenced your development.
I have had a lot of good teachers who cared a great deal about intellectual development and trying to find the right fit for the people they're talking to, not just for them, going all the way back to my undergraduate years. In graduate school, I focused then on political economy of development, underdevelopment, and IPE more generally. And I worked with Bud Duvall at Minnesota, who was a wonderful advisor, both for what he let you do and for what he didn't let you do. I had read Frank, I had read Dos Santos, I had read Cardoso. Then I began to read other things as well, more broadly. We all read Susan Strange to see what she had to say. I made friends with people in political economy who I thought were very interesting, with Craig Murphy early on and Spike Peterson early on, and tried to understand what they were on about. I met Gunder Frank in about 87 or 88, I can't remember. He was an irascible guy but you could feel the weight of some of the things he said. Bill Thompson, whose work whose work is always analytically sophisticated, theoretically informed, historical, and substantively interesting. Chris Chaston, who took a tremendous interest in my career. I don't know why, but I will be eternally grateful. And his work on a deep history, broad sweep, and as a sociologist, it's a breath of fresh air to kind of get out of the blinkers that people who study politics tend to be held fast by. It's a social anthropologist named Jonathan Friedman, who's always controversial. And I started reading him. I kept reading him, partly because I was fascinated by the up-close and personal orientations of social anthropology. I had always considered that a macro kind of a thing, not necessarily. And then in the field as well, lately, if you want to know who I'm reading lately, I'm reading Jerry Cohn, because I need to understand financialization. Years ago, I read Phil Cerny's stuff, and I understood from that an awful lot about why things were important. And I think Jerry Cohn is now taking that even a step further, and I get a perspective from him that is both immediate and thoughtful. So.
And this, go on. Sorry.
And it's really interesting. Do you kind of consider yourself a sociologist then?
Right. Yeah. Really?
It's really funny.
Yeah.
That, it's kind of that's not funny.
It's okay. Don't worry. That might be right. We'll see how the career pans out.
Yeah. How people kind of consider, think about what their intellectual disciplinary home is.
Right. I started reading world systems analysis. I actually did my dissertation on a world systems topic. And I was reading economic historians. I was taking courses in economic history and in political economy. I didn't take courses in sociology, but I read sociologists. And I thought the idea of moving between the disciplines was really important. The categories, probably because people in political economy realized this earlier than people on the earth, the categories are constraining. But there's a trick, right? It's always dangerous to trespass. You never know what you're going to find or what you're going to pull out. And you could be viciously wrong, right? I mean, you dip your hand in and you pull out a theoretical strain, and it's just the wrong, right? It's narrow and it's not what most people are doing. So I started working as best I could and hanging out with sociologists so I didn't make those mistakes, or at least I less so. Now, there was a time I was better cited in sociology than in political science, but that's just because of who I was, what I was writing about and who I was hanging out with.
So to follow that up then, would you identify with the label of IPE?
Yes, I think I would. I would. Institutionally, I got involved quite early. I chaired the section for a couple of years. I ran their program for a couple of years. I was present at the creation of RIPE and some of the other key outlets. I edited the IPE yearbook years back. So I think institutionally the answer is yes. Intellectually it probably is too. I just do it differently, far more historically than most folks. But I read as broadly as I can. And if they're not reading me, that's okay. But when we talk, I try to interject some sense of depth, right? Historical depth into the work. Are we sure we're seeing something new? Have we seen this before? What elements have changed? And of course, what elements have not changed, which is sometimes a more interesting and a far harder question to ask and answer.
And so to pick up a few of those things, we'll move on to the ISA things. I know that's been sort of really important for you, and you've been important to it. But to pick up the kind of work first, you're unusual in the sense of, the kind of canvas that you work on, both historically and also the interdisciplinary focus that you talked about. So before I met you, I'd never thought about archaeology.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's right.
And things I thought about archaeology.
Right. Yeah.
Great fun, but not in terms of the study of world inequality and so on. You put into some people certainly opened our eyes to that. I wondered if you wanted to say some words about precisely why you take such a historical view and such an interdisciplinary one.
That wasn't the question I was expecting, and that's okay.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. I thought you were going to go the other way. How does ISA facilitate that?
But we will get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess what I found consistently interesting was that if I wanted to understand a process, then I sort of thought it was going to be important for me to understand the genesis of that process. And if you start reading in that vein, and you realize you're just going back and back and back and back, historians know things. They don't always know how to talk to social scientists. Anthropologists and archaeologists know things, and they do know how to talk to social scientists. And I was fascinated by what I was learning. No matter how far back I went, I couldn't seem to get to the beginnings. And so I had to learn to ask different questions. When does a quantitative change become a qualitative change? Right? I was interested in some of the great historic debates around world systems analysis, and one of them has to do with the 500-year history. And Gunder Frank started arguing that 500 years was far too little to understand this. I was fascinated by the argument, scared to death of that argument. I didn't know how much more I could read. But you find scholars who do know that. You find out what they know. You tell them what you know. You share. We've brought people to the ISA who are archaeologists and philologists. We had the sitting head of the Smithsonian Institution once. It really is kind of interesting. And if you can find common ground and break through the kind of jargon that jails us all, you can learn interesting stuff. And you take that stuff back and you ask some important questions of it. What do I need to know? What do I need to know it? And that's sort of why I went the way I went. I was at a panel at this conference, and there was a senior scholar of political economy who'd written a new book, and he was being harassed by his panelists. But aren't you now a constructivist? Tell us more about your epiphany, whatever it is. And I have to say it bothered me a little bit. Although I think the intramural debates we have are really important, homogeneity in any of its forms is not helpful. And he was bringing interesting points in and using a constructivist lens. I thought that was laudatory in and of itself, and the folks should say, okay, thank you, and what else can we do, and what else can we learn, and how do you feel being a constructivist? Do you feel icky? Is it okay? I've always believed that, and I've always tried to encourage scholars who do things very differently than I do to do those things. And then tell me what they've discovered. What have we found? My lens works for me in some areas, not as well as I thought it would for my whole career, so I use different lenses. I can be, kind of, I don't know that I want to use this term on film, but the term is theoretically promiscuous, really, if you want to think about it. And I can learn from that. I understand that's not necessarily philosophically legitimate in every case, but I do think it makes us stronger. There are things I understand, or put differently and far more modestly, there are things I study that other people don't because of how I see things work. And sometimes that brings forth interesting insights.
What would you say? So you've mentioned the 500-year history thing and the boundaries issues. Mm-hmm. What would you say the major contribution that your work has made to the field?
My work's a little strange. I like to bounce around. Okay, it's like short attention span intellect here. I pick up different issues. I try to find people who are asking really interesting questions and provide some additional insight or additional criticism, or pick up work on the margin. Does it work? Does what you're saying work in some place I know about? I like to think that the broader and more historical perspective helps inform people and will continue to help inform people. You read a piece and you really don't know what I'm on about. And when I get to the end and say, okay, now here are the 3 things we now know or should know that we didn't know before, maybe other people will say, oh, okay, I see how he got there. I can now get there. In a sense, that's a theoretical, or probably more narrowly, a methodological addition. Then I do tend to give very, very careful reading to text and to my colleagues. And I try very hard, therefore, to crystallize what's being said and help move it forward. And my own work, I think, provides some of that background where I have seen so many other people say, well, we're going to touch the work of scholar X so that we can look on page 159 and find the relevant paragraph and take off from there. And I try very hard to say, no, we should look at this as a set of processes or a historical process or an interaction and say, all right, does that process help us understand what's going on elsewhere? That's kind of what I've tried to do. I wrote a piece on the Irish and the Vikings quite recently. Had a great time doing it. It was very enjoyable. But it was for a small meeting on the question of global boundaries and civilizational boundaries. And what it was really about was globalization. What constitutes a really important fundamental set of interactions and what doesn't? And I had to get there by looking at the Irish and the Vikings, okay? But the broader question and the broader group I'm a part of hopefully will come up with responses that are more weighty than gee, the Vikings are cool, right?
If somebody was coming to your work, so a PhD student or a graduate student or something, coming to your work or world systems stuff more generally, what would be your kind of few words of advice about how to approach that literature?
This is a dangerous question. And the reason it's dangerous is because given fiscal constraints and monetary constraints and weird policies, we are trying to move graduate students through programs far quicker. We expect them to write more and publish more and be more relevant and do it all at the same time. I think that puts those perspectives that require deep reading at a significant disadvantage. And so I'm torn. On the one hand, I want to say this will provide you with some real insights and tools you can use almost no matter where your career takes you. On the other hand, I have to say, the startup costs here are very significant. So think long and hard before you say, well, yes, I would like to master 500 or 600 years of history so that I can start. And so that is a dicey question. So, right.
So, extend that theme then in terms of the discipline. So you started us out with the challenges that you thought were important, nuclear war and then poverty and sort of material need. What would you say are the big challenges for the discipline are now?
If I take my world system background seriously, we tend to look at cycles of various sorts, and we tend to debate about them endlessly and wonder if they exist. But the one that I think is most important for everyday life is the cycle of hegemony and rivalry. In periods of hegemony or unipolarity, I don't care what the term is, the answers to all the questions of life seem to be answered. Okay, the dominant power has asked the questions, has offered answers to those questions. We don't see a lot of contention over those, interestingly enough. We see it at the margin. We see insurgencies, and we see terrorism, and we see intervention. We see a dominant and totalizing economic systems. But we don't see, as we do see in the period of rivalry, great power mobilization and huge debates over what the issues really should be, and building of ideologies, contesting ideologies, and the fragmentation of economic systems. Those are very different eras in which to live. They really are. And the challenge that we face now, that my students face, both my undergraduates, right, and my graduate students, is as we move more toward a system of rivalry, the issues change, the dynamics change. And we're not going to be able to look behind us and say, oh, those are the issues that will continue. They will become different issues. It's not that they're better or worse, but they are different. They won't be able to talk to their parents, biological or intellectual.
So this is a slightly pessimistic view of where we're going in terms of stability of the world system?
Yes, I think it could be substantively, but once again, I don't know that the periods are better or worse. We can say a lot of nice things about hegemony, but you do have to fit the mold, okay? And there is huge, and there are people who don't fit the mold and don't count and don't get to play, right, as it were, and their lives don't evidence much potential for change. That's not happy either. Where rivalry probably hurts us is with the things that we see in the advanced, industrial or post-industrial countries. The recreation of military threat, the recreation of fears of technology, the constant and incessant questioning, what are the big issues, right? We haven't had to deal with those before, but I don't know that they're necessarily worse, leaving the question of nuclear war behind, right, than the kinds of oppressions, if you will, that exist in periods of hegemony.
And that's a really deep societal view of the hegemony as well. It's
yes.
About the stability of society, not just about the interstate system.
Right, free trade and No, hegemony is a global environment, and so is rivalry.
Okay, brilliant. And do you think IPE as a discipline is well suited right now to deal with those kinds of challenges? How to come to terms with a period?
Wow. Yes and no. And that's a joke. The joke is that for every good question in political economy, the answer is yes and no. What I like best about political economy is that it remains a big tent. Yeah, we have our arguments and we divide up our journals and we say, uncomradely things about one another and stuff. But it remains a big tent. And so if I'm looking at trade or taxation policy, if I'm looking at financialization or underdevelopment, if I'm looking at labor and labor mobilization, it doesn't matter what I'm looking at. That heterogeneity means we can do a lot of interesting things. And I'm hopeful that political economy will retain that big tent feel. I believe the section at the ISA will. And so whatever the problems that we face are, someone out there has an interesting view of them, and the rest of us can catch on. It's still very much a political science kind of place, but it doesn't want to be a political science. It wants to bring in new and interesting perspectives. And that's what made me so excited about the association. This really is my intellectual home. This is some years I only go to one meeting, and this is it. I work it very hard. I want to meet new people. I want to hear things. I want to make connections with old friends and colleagues who are doing interesting things. When I started in this profession, I had a job at a small college, a small university in the Mid-South in the U.S. And I had to ask myself, how many other people are in the same boat, right? One or two colleagues locally, and that's it. So how do you reach out? How do you expand? How do you stay active? Well, yeah, you can read the journals, but I have too many interests to be able to keep up with my reading in all those areas. I want to talk to 2 or 3 people who know about topic X and topic Y and topic Z. I can do that here. So.
and you've had several positions in the ISA, as you mentioned. I mean, what have you tried to achieve by using those positions? I see you very much as somebody who tries to use that for a particular purpose.
It's important to bring, to make people feel welcome and bring in a variety of perspectives, a variety of individuals, so that we can increase, right, our what we know and how we know it. And almost everything I've done, I think, has been in that vein. Some of it has been basically, service oriented, and but I've always tried to integrate people into the association. If you want to become active, I really don't care what your ism is. Do you treat people with respect? Yes. Okay. I will do my best to find you a route in, because volunteers are always in short supply, right? That's what I did when I worked my way up through the section. We tried doing that when we ran the IPE yearbook, which was was that project. I did run the conference years ago. I had an advantage. We didn't have 6,000 people. I tried very hard to match the junior scholars in an area with the senior scholars they really needed to be working with. I really tried to make sure that panels where the people should hear what going on in other panels followed each other in the same room. That's pretty much been what I've tried to accomplish. When we started the big encyclopedia project, the compendium project, there was concern. Who would seek to dominate this, right? Who got to define war? Right? My argument was, not on my watch. You want to define war, you go right ahead. You want to define war, give me something of a different title, and you can do it too. And we'll see, right? We'll see what perspectives work. I think that's been the dominant theme of what I've always tried to do.
And who are the people that you're reading now that you think might, maybe some of the new people that you've helped to feel welcome in the association, or just others that you think are helping you come to grips with the kind of big challenges?
I read William Thompson's work for reasons I suggested, right? I think the whole package is there. The historical background, the analytical rigor, and the substantive interests are consistent. And I read Chaston because I want that broader perspective, and he provides that broader perspective. In more traditional IPE, I think I suggested I read Jerry Cohn because I want to know more about financialization, and that's kind of where I'm going. That's who I read. Those are folks I've been reading consistently over the last 5, 6, 7 years. Then I sample pretty much everything else that I can find with a title that's interesting, although I must admit I often don't get much past the abstract, right? But I will, right? If it's interesting and I can keep on, I will.
And what's your current projects? I know you've done quite a lot of different things very recently. So you've returned to the nuclear thing and the treaties.
Right. Yeah. The nuclear piece was was kind of a one-off. Actually, I had done work, as I suggested as an undergraduate in that, and I asked myself the question: if I'm serious about this move from hegemony to rivalry, what does that mean for nuclear war? That was depressing. I had a wonderful time writing it, and I moved on. I'm not going to go down that path again more seriously. For many years, I've been writing about multilateral treaties. In the wake of 9/11, everybody was talking about how conflictful and devastating the world system was. Now, look, I study underdevelopment. Okay, 5,000 people die from various diseases and from hunger daily. Okay, this is not to detract from the tragedy, but if we're going to all basically turn and say, well, the world is a horrible place because this happened? No, the world can be a pretty horrible place for other reasons. And I didn't know what I could do. So what I decided to do was try to study some facet of cooperation and see where that had been going and how long that had been around and whether that had been impacted. So I had just started doing the encyclopedia project, the compendium. I didn't have a lot of extra time. I wanted to do something terribly traditional. So we found a number of sources on multilateral treaties and just started counting them. Okay, how many countries? When were they signed? Where were they signed? How many people signed them? What kind of a topic was this? And when we were done, we had a data set of something like 7,000 treaties over 500 years. Well, just for fun, you can ask some really interesting descriptive questions. Has it always been going up, right? Or does it emerge after each crisis, like people have suggested? The security people tend to look very episodically at things like war. Other folks tend to view international organization as a constant upsweep. And sure enough, we found treaties in one area were cyclical and the others were all upsweeps. It was really interesting. So I continue to work in that area. My own historical work pretty much mirrors what the world system people are on about at any given time. I like to figure out what they're saying and see if I can add to it. I have a project on political psychology, believe it or not. I'm interested in the psychological dynamics of decline because that's an issue. And in fact, I've preempted myself. I'm not even looking at decline. I'm looking at fear of decline. And I found a tremendous literature in organizational psychology that says if you're a high status individual and you fear you're in decline, you're going to overcompensate and shoot yourself in the foot very painfully. And so I've played that out over the years. So those are the things I'm doing at the moment.
Okay, and you started already to give some advice to younger scholars early in their career or just thinking about their career. What sorts of advice would you give a new scholar in this area?
In political economy?
Yeah.
This is a fantastic field, in great part because you can do almost anything you want with it. Make sure to read broadly. Don't let them make you decide on your dissertation topic in week 3 of your first year. It's not healthy. It's not intellectually healthy. I'm not sure how to do it because I know funding is being cut and you're being told to hurry. But you have to maintain some off-the-wall interests in things to keep your own intellectual juices running. Because 10 or 12 years from now, when the topic they forced you into dealing with at a forced pace has run its course intellectually, what are you going to do next? Right? You sort of need to keep a hand in other areas. I don't know if it's great advice, but I think in the long term, it'll be very helpful.
And one of the questions suggested to us by one of the other interviewees was, what do you like about the job? What
don't I like about the job? I have friends who are in the arts, right? My friends who are actors, they don't understand just how jealous they should be of me, right? I give 45-minute soliloquies multiple times a week, and no one can leave, right? This is a fantastic. The bully pulpit is really fantastic. If you take students seriously, and I do, there's also a lot of not quite so glib interaction that goes on to help people really understand how to make a start at comprehending their world. So I like teaching. I really do. I like doing my research, although someone did point out to me recently, and I make jokes about it, that what I really want to be when I grow up as an undergraduate, right, I can make, I find interesting topics all around, and I can write about them for a year or 2 years or 3 years, then I can move on. And in part that's funny, but in part that's also true. I can follow my interests more than a lot of my friends and colleagues who've gone into other fields. Dealing with universities, our service component, is not so much fun. My colleague Peter Taylor, the world system geographer, wrote a tremendous set of kind of autobiographical essays in which near the end he said, well, when the accountants took over, I renamed universities. I now call them ULCs, ugly little corporations. You have to push back against that. You can't just let that happen. It's not right. Real lives are at stake. The lives of my undergraduates and their intellectual lives, the lives of my graduate students, the lives of my junior colleagues. And then there's a chance to do service at this level, at the organizational level. It's not always what the department wants you to do, but I think it has value. I think it has real value. And here as well, we play a role in the development of all of our colleagues, intellectual lives.
And where I got that question from was, at the end of any kind of interview, I always try and say, what should we have asked you that we didn't? Is there anything that you think we should have asked that we didn't ask you?
No, you asked good questions. Maybe the one you left out was, what will I do next? What is my next intellectual project? Okay. Once again, if I take world systems analysis seriously and look at hegemony and rivalry, the political economy of rivalry is statism or mercantilism. And I read a great deal about that 30 years ago. And I may well return to it because there are things. Statism is not just one big ugly, a party where everybody tries to get what they can for themselves. We study statism or mercantilism to see what its patterns and processes have been. What has happened, how has it declined, how has it risen, stuff like that. And I may well go back to that once I clear the decks of some other project.